Victorian England in Assassin's Creed is a match made in heaven. Infamous for oppression and uprising, the themes presented throughout the Industrial Revolution seem like the perfect place to set an Assassin's Creed game, and was highly demanded by fans in the early 2010s. As the franchise began to branch out, Ubisoft was eager to scratch this itch, and delivered Assassin's Creed Syndicate in the fall of 2015. However, the game had vastly underperformed in terms of living up to the potential of this period. The bleak tone and darker themes of literature from the time were swapped out for a lighter and more comedic tone. Characters that glossed over the oppression of the time in service of a space MacGuffin and a cartoonish villain that never made an impact on the story. Because of this, I found the main game of Assassin's Creed Syndicate to be a massive missed opportunity that didn't do the time period justice. It lacked in-depth and meaningful themes associated with the Industrial Revolution, and treated the main cast as a bunch of celebrities that you bump into. Whilst I think the protagonists Jacob and Evie in their own regards had interesting developments with their characters, it wasn't enough to fill the hole I had in my heart that the game hadn't lived up to my expectations, when it seemed so easy to achieve. With the game shipped and the reception lukewarm, I gave up on the game shortly after finishing the story back in 2015, and returned to playing Unity, as I'd found the unstable but unrestricted parkour and massive open world of Paris to be a more enjoyable and replayable experience. Meanwhile, Assassin's Creed Syndicate dropped its £15 expansion, Jack the Ripper. I gave it a side glance and moved on. And how wrong I was. On this channel, I've been conducting a series of character studies on the protagonists of Assassin's Creed, and as I go through, I find myself exploring the side content along the way, and making separate videos to fill in the gaps on my journey of exploring my favourite franchise. And recently, I was wrapping up my two-parter on Jacob and Evie Fry, when I realised that there was an Assassin's Creed expansion that I had never played, that being Jack the Ripper. And so I booted up my Xbox One, and what I found was startling. Jack the Ripper from the offset paints a very different picture of Assassin's Creed Syndicate, to the point where it feels like a completely different game. The world is fittingly bleak and depressing in the wake of a serial killer stalking the streets of London. The expansion deals with the themes of abandonment and mental illness, and features heavy stakes in the story where you question the fate of the characters right through until the very end. It's not just impressive, but compared to Syndicate, I would call it a corrected replacement to the game, and that's why today I'd like to dive into the Jack the Ripper expansion, starting with the story and then the gameplay as part of my coverage of Assassin's Creed Syndicate. And if you want to watch the previous videos looking at Jacob and Evie Fry in depth, then the card is on screen now for you to take a look, and please don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss out on the future uploads. The previous videos on Jacob and Evie provide a good backdrop and context for my thoughts going into this DLC, and so I do recommend you start there. With that said, let's begin.
Welcome to the reunion, Miss Fry.
Set 20 years after the events of Assassin's Creed Syndicate, Jack the Ripper follows Evie Fry as she returns to London after some time away, following news that her brother has gone missing, and that a string of murders follows in his path. She must uncover the clues to his disappearance and track down the elusive assailant before he gets to her first. As a premise, it's a strong start. Establishing a time gap between the main game and this one helps to make the tone less of a whiplash, but also makes the story organic, and better flowing because of it. The expansion follows a tightly executed 3-act structure, in which Evie will investigate the Ripper's killings in 3 distinct areas, giving the story a faster and more pinpoint focus compared to the main game. Even though you'll be hopping between Evie and the Ripper, much like you did Jacob and Evie, where the switches are in service of one flowing narrative, and act to highlight not only the gruesome acts Jack commits, but also how Evie is slipping into his mindset as she delves deeper into the morbid slayings in London, and the two may be becoming not so different after all. The story starts, however, following Jacob Fry, as we see that a murder has taken place in the dark winter streets. Not just any killing, but one of Jacob's assassins. This is the biggest departure from reality the game takes, and it makes or breaks your commitment to the story. Jack the Ripper is an ex-pupil of Jacob's that has gone rogue and has been hunting down female assassins working for Jacob to lure him and Evie out of the shadows so he can claim his revenge. If you can get on board with the infamous serial killer Jack the Ripper being involved with the assassins, then from here you'll have nothing to worry about. However, if that is too far-fetched and stupid to get your head around, then it's never going to win you over. The reality is that Jack the Ripper in this DLC is a brand new character, and unrelated to any historical icon that may share the same name. For me, I was completely okay with this, and I didn't mind the real-life retcon, but it's subjective how you feel about that.
I told you to stay away from me. Stop publishing his letters. You've turned an unknown miscreant into a legend, and that's exactly what he wants.
Jacob! Thank God I found you. It's the Ripper. He's done it again. Katie! Oh, he can't. No, he can't have. And Lizzie. Not both. Not in one night.
Nellie, remember what I said. Now go.
It was perfect. Perfect. Everything, down to the last minute details.
The notable point starting off here is flipping everything. The tone is bleak and depressing, as we see the horrors a serial killer could inflict on the streets of London, the sincerity Jacob has towards it, and how he genuinely fears for his assassins' lives, as he nervously moves his informant along. 20 years ago, Jacob Fry was wide-eyed and ready for adventure, but now is a very different character. Still a naive one, but the years have made him more timid and humble, which is a natural development for his character, and I adore his portrayal here. It's a massive improvement and far less irritating. I also love the world building here. Without needing to see it, we understand that Jacob is in charge of the Brotherhood, whilst Evie is away, and works closely with the police to keep things in check. He treats his assassins with care and affection. As the leader of the Rooks, he has learned the best way to cater towards people's needs, and he proves himself to be selfless, as he brings himself out into the open to save the lives of his apprentices. This, however, takes a gut-punching turn, as we switch perspectives to Jack himself. Complete with crazed voices in his head and a distorted screen, Jack is unwell, but the player has to be put in his shoes and carry out his wince-worthy acts of violence. As a powerful opening act, we are tasked to hunt down and kill Jacob Fry, going on a rampage and inducing fear into all those around us, using the new fear system, which we will get into later. Jack is well portrayed as a force to be reckoned with, as he stalks and catches up with a terrified Jacob and beats him down until his fate is left unknown.
Don't you see the irony, brother? No!
Jack, we can fix you.
Fix me? I am the solution.
At this point, I found myself having an existential crisis. In my character studies, I like to be objective, but I will say here that I don't like Jacob Fry personally. He was always like a spoiled brat to me, and never came across likeable or having a fulfilling purpose in the story. But all that changed in 10 minutes when this DLC started. Here we have Jacob portrayed as a man who has made some kind of error that has led to Jack becoming a murderer, and he's willing to accept that mistake and risk his life to save others. showing him to have grown into a selfless and admirable leader, and one that I was scared for when Jack finally caught up to him. I didn't want to see him be killed, and not seeing any news of him until the end of the game kept that thick tension high that the DLC was excelling at. Evie shares this same worry, as she leaves India immediately and arrives in London. We learn that in the 20-year gap, Jacob and Evie went to India with Henry Green. However, whilst Evie stayed there with Henry and got married, only 5 years later Jacob returned to London. It's explained that Jacob brought the recruits from London over to India in order to learn the new fear tactics that the Brotherhood over there were developing, and he came back without any supposed bad blood. However, one of the boys that went through to learn these new tactics was Jack, and he is the one now using those tactics to strike fear into the people of London. I feel like at this point there was meant to be some ambiguity to the Ripper's identity when searching Jacob's apartment, as we find tools used by Jacob in India that now resemble the Ripper's arsenal, meant to throw suspicion Jacob's way. The boy Jacob travelled home with from India could have been an effective red herring if Jacob was the intended identity of the Ripper at first. However, since we've already seen the prologue's events play out, there is no question that Jacob is not the Ripper and that Jack the lad is. Also, a side note, when I was doing some research for this video, I watched interviews with Paul Amos and Victoria Atkins, the voice actors for Jacob and Evie respectively, and Paul let on a very interesting little tidbit when he explained that he actually had a lot of influence on Jacob's role in the DLC.
Because there was no opportunity for it.
No, I don't know. I like to say, I guess Jacob had a way different ending in that one, and I kind of had to fight for it a bit. So in the end, he just had like the pirate eye patch.
Now, it's up for speculation what those changes were, but I have a feeling it's either that Jacob was meant to be killed in the prologue, or that Jacob was meant to be the Ripper. This would have been very out of character for Jacob, and it would have needed a hefty amount of explaining which the DLC wouldn't have had time to do. And honestly, good on him for suggesting this change, as I think it does serve the story better. Unfortunately, because of these supposed changes, this makes the investigation in Jacob's apartment fall a bit flat, since we already know everything that happened beforehand, and it only really acts to catch Evie up to speed. Upon finding out her brother could have been killed at the hands of the apprentice, the stakes of the story become personal, since Evie is now a prime target of the Ripper, but we still don't know why. Upon picking up the pieces of Jacob's investigation, Evie finds herself at the local brothel and learns of Lady Oers, an informant that may have information on the Ripper's whereabouts.
Smile and be polite, or I'll tell the Ripper where you sleep, my beauties. Game Fry. Take Nellie and see to it that woman does not follow us.
This adds to the Ripper's infamy and how well known and feared he is in the city. However, the dialogue here is a bit clunky, as we don't get a proper introduction to this character, or any idea of her connection to Jack. If Lady Oers were to be taken out of the picture, then the Ripper would supposedly lose his eyes and ears in London, and be forced to work on his own. I find it strange that Jack even needs an accomplice, and it reminds me of Crawford Starrick in the worst way possible, as it's distracting the player from time that could be better spent developing Jack, and acts as a neater way to conclude a first act with a big assassination mission than being in a meaningful way. The following set piece takes Evie outside of London, to a massive estate that serves as the expansion's first black box mission. As I said in my Evie Fry character study, Evie was not given many opportunities to show off her skill set, but thankfully that is remedied here, with a large isolated level that has been designed with the black box format in mind, giving Evie multiple opportunities to tackle this target. I found it quite straightforward to achieve, which may be in part due to the broken fear system that was introduced, which we'll get into on the gameplay segment. When Evie successfully infiltrates the grounds of the manor and up to the top floor, she can kill Lady Oers by using her husband as a decoy to get in close.
Darling, I have a most delicious surprise for you.
Not now, husband. Can you not see how occupied I am?
In her confession scene, we learn nothing, which leads to an exciting revelation that this entire sequence has served no narrative purpose whatsoever, and all we're left with is another clue leading to the next act of the story. What baffles me is that after such a strong start, it seems like the writers created the DLC with only Jack in mind. Lady Owers is given no dialogue and no character. I mean, yeah, she's given dialogue, but let's be honest, it's cookie cutter at best. We know that she has some kind of agreement with Jack, and has kidnapped a group of men for Jack to take prisoner, but with no idea why or what purpose it serves. Perhaps if she was working for the Ripper so that her girls could be spared, then it would make sense. But also Jack in this version is hunting down assassins, and they just so happen to be females, to draw Jacob and Evie out. That's his motivation for the killings. He wants revenge for a reason yet unknown, and yet Lady Owers has been written into the story as if this version of Jack is the real-life counterpart that hunted down specifically prostitutes. This is where I think some behind-the-scenes turmoil has taken place, on whether to treat Jack as a historically accurate character or as an ex-assassin. And I'm actually going to do a quick rewrite of this. Here's my pitch. Make Lady Owers an ex-assassin too. Now working at a brothel, and she thinks she's safe. After all, she's given up on the creed, only for her girls to start going missing because of the Ripper, assuming that they are also assassins because of their connections to her. This means that Evie could be tasked with saving Lady Owers before the Ripper gets to her, so the black box mission is infiltrating the manor the same as before, as Lady Owers can make all of her guards, consider Evie hostile, and so the mission can play out exactly the same because she's told them to kill on sight or something. And when Evie gets there and sees that Lady Owers has been killed and a photograph could be pinned to her body, all of her girls are now at risk of the Ripper. Evie won't even know if it's safe for them to leave, and this ends the sequence on a dark note, with a newfound shift in dynamics, where Evie now has to play into the Ripper's hands to get closer to him.
And the Oscar goes to...
Now back to the next sequence, we start with the news that the Ripper's contact has been fabricating the newspapers, and framed Evie for the killing at the manor, which the Ripper had conducted after she left. Now I'm just saying this does make more sense in my rewrite, because if Evie was blamed for the Ripper killing Lady Owers, then, I'm just saying. I haven't mentioned Aberline yet, but he's a very effective stand-in for Jim Gordon here, as a detective trusting the assassins to conduct the investigation, and toes the line between trusting Evie and considering her just as bad as the Ripper. Compared to the main game of Syndicate, where the man is only a bad running joke who keeps dressing up in bad disguises that the twins see through, honestly, I had to check the wiki to see if these were the same character. After tracking down the only living man in the photograph on Lady Owers' body and rescuing his son, Evie learns where the rest of the men were taken and sets out to find them at another new location. A huge Hulk prison ship now being used by Jack to take hostages. It seems Jack has been kidnapping Templars and other people in power to rule over the streets of London by threatening them to work with him. This does a good job of once again showing how Jack intends to rule out of fear. However, I do question what his larger motive is here. Does he enjoy causing people fear so much that he wants the whole city at his knees? Or is this something smaller in scale, and still just an intricately planned scheme to create a personal hell for Evie? I think at this point in the story, it should be more clear of what it is we're trying to stop Jack from doing. There seems to be motivation piled on top of motivation, where Jack's intentions should be more clear, but yet we have to believe he now wants to rule London from the shadows. I think it's a personal preference, but I would have loved a smaller scope of the story, where Evie is just trying to uncover what Jacob has done to cause Jack to go crazy. However, the DLC has brought in so many new characters and players in the story that it's feeling less and less clear what the intention is. Upon sneaking into the prison and assassinating the warden, we're treated to a scene that once again reinforces the idea of Jacob potentially being the Ripper.
What
do you think is
This was your brother's vision. His inspiration.
I don't believe you.
He told Mr. Jack how to rip the filth from this rotten city, but you don't have the balls to see what's right and necessary.
Where's Jack? Where's the Ripper?
Who the fuck is that guy?
The warden tries to convince Evie that Jacob was the one to teach Jack how to enact all of these horrific crimes and get away with it, and that he was somewhat the mastermind behind the whole thing and could potentially be the Ripper himself. This falls apart immediately because once again we've already seen Jacob in the story, disagreeing with Jack and being an all-around nice guy to the assassins that he works with. This makes me think either the tone of the prologue was way off and should have been more ambiguous, or that the writers of the expansion had to rewrite it in afterwards because it doesn't fit with the narrative they're trying to spin here. Also, the idea of Jacob going from saying Assassin Christmas to being a serial killer would have been a harder sell for anyone to believe, and there was only one occasion in Syndicate where I got the impression that Jacob may desensitize himself from killing, and that was purposefully ignored immediately after. Rupert Ferris was the example there if anyone wants to go looking. Evie contacts the police and asks them to visit the Hulk prison and seize the area from Jack's crazed lieutenants. However, once again, we switch perspectives to play as Jack, and he is now forced to cover his tracks by going on an insane murder spree and kill all of the police Evie sent, along with any witnesses that could unravel his scheme. Upon returning to London, Evie happens across another gruesome murder scene left by Jack, and this is where Evie breaks, and we start to get an interesting arc begin to unravel, one in which Evie starts to become more and more like what the police accuse her of being. She nearly assaults a police officer for information, and then threatens Aberline on the identity of the body. Aberline states that he can no longer defend her, and that eventually she will have to take responsibility for the Ripper's murders, and maybe be hunted down by the police. And from this point onwards she will have a broken trust with the police, and they will become hostile in the gameplay. And to be fair, it can't be excused from the mountain of evidence that the assassins are behind the attacks, because of the Ripper's tools. This is where the stakes should have been established earlier with Lady Oz. Once she died, there would have been a ticking clock before the police could now catch up with the secret that Jack was an assassin, which could ruin the Order and the Fry reputation. Now that this has finally happened, Evie must go rogue to continue the hunt for Jack without the police's assistance, after so many were killed at the Hulk prison. After investigating Jack's original crimes against the female assassins, Evie finds messages left for her using Eagle Vision. Here we finally get Jack's motivation. You see, his mother was wrongfully murdered, and now Jack considers all of his work to be revenge, and blames the assassins for not taking more action with their influence taken from Crawford Starrick. He wants to enact revenge on the city for what it did to his mother, and needs to eliminate the assassins from the board so that nobody can stop him. This is why he needs to be in collaboration with the press and the politicians, because that's how far the assassin influence has spread. It's an unfortunate situation where Jacob took in a mentally ill child suffering after the death of his mother and was mistreated afterwards. He was unable to nurture him, but instead fed into Jack's bloodlust, thus creating the Ripper. However, I think this also absolves Jacob of any guilt, since it's not his fault that any of this happened, and thus I'd argue you could remove the assassins from this story entirely, and it wouldn't really change. Why does Jack want revenge on Evie? Well, because she could stop him. That's pretty much it. There's more evidence there, but, well, it really is that simple, since it's never established the relationship between the two to know why Evie is actually being targeted. Also, another thing of note is that it's actually a Templar that killed Jack's mother, and so the assassins have already given Jack the revenge he seeks. Because Crawford Starrick is gone, I don't understand why Jack blames the assassins, so it makes his character difficult to follow, and throughout my playthrough I was lost on multiple occasions as to what was actually happening. This revelation does however kick off the third act of the game, in which Jack returns to the mental asylum he was placed in as a child, to seek revenge on the doctors that were mistreating him, and also to erase any evidence of his existence there. As Jack, you conduct a brutal murder spree in the asylum, and it takes some balls for Ubisoft to let you enact this vicious spree. I was thinking throughout about just how awful and possible something like this could be. It shows the horrors of Jack's murders in full force, as he hunts and kills everyone in the asylum, without remorse or hesitation. But Jack has known them for years, showing he doesn't even care about their final words. He doesn't care for any kind of confession scene. He's truly detached and deranged as he conducts this brutal act. After releasing the inmates and starting an uprising, Evie must then follow Jack into the pits of the asylum to put an end to this scheme. This is a morbid location to set the final fight in, with the screams of inmates above being heard as you navigate the dank catacombs of the asylum in an attempt to take Jack down. Being an assassin, Jack's tactics are more than up to scratch, and so you can't take him out face to face. But a lot like the Mr. Freeze fight in Arkham City, you must use all your acquired skills to sneakily take him down, using skill over his brutal approach. Now that said, I can't ignore that there is a pretty infamous meme here, where Evie says,
"You will not make a monster of me!"
whilst pummeling the shit out of the mentally ill psychopath. And yeah, it is certainly at odds with the tone here. I think it would have been more effective to highlight how Evie was becoming like Jack, by giving in to the brutality and giving her character a much more darker shade from the quiet and studious Evie of the main game. It almost delivers on the 180 for her character by making her win by giving in to her fear and lashing out, whereas Jacob was the one to lose by holding back. I do like the parallel, and I wish it could have been explored further, since this is never commented on again. And so for all we know, Evie could have ended the DLC as somewhat more unhinged and not quite out the rabbit hole. Once you kill Jack, his confession is surprisingly poor.
We're the same, you and I.
Oh, Jack. You were an assassin, yes, but we are not the same. And that is why your memory must be erased for all time. Rest in peace now, Jack. You and your twisted acolytes.
He only has one line and then keels over, which is a bit shit. I expected something more along the lines of Hatham, never doubting he was right, but also congratulating the mindset it took to go against him. To not give him any kind of conversation sounds to me like they just wanted to wrap things up as quickly as possible. And in the writer's defence, this is a character that hasn't shut up throughout the entire expansion. At long last, Evie is reunited with Jacob, left to rot in the asylum like Jack was. It's a nice parallel, but it's also a relief to see that Jacob is still alive, even if just barely. It's another missed opportunity to not have Jacob speak, but in all honesty, not having Jacob say anything is actually a great way of concluding his character. This cheeky chappie was always having a Marvel book of jokes up his sleeve, but now not even being able to bring himself to speak after the events of this DLC is a really solid and depressing note to end on, and it's very commendable for just how much Ubisoft committed with this storyline.
It's over, Jacob. I'm here.
While the narrative does leave a lot to be desired, this is where the DLC concludes, telling us a story in which one of Jacob's past mistakes has to be fixed by... Hang on a minute, we've done this before. But here it is accompanied by a bleak tone and oppressive atmosphere that sells you on the potential Syndicate could have had, and so I think it's only right to now move on to the gameplay.
Welcome to the reunion, Miss Fry.
Since this is the first time I'm mentioning the gameplay of Syndicate in this series, let's get some general thoughts out the way. The parkour in this game is a noticeable step down from Unity. Whereas Unity was completely unrestricted on movement, it led to a lot of issues, but also a lot more fun to be had. Going into Syndicate feels like the training wheels were put back on, and a lot of the descent options are removed, and certain gaps can't be covered without stiff character response times. The rope launcher doesn't help either. God, I despise using this thing. It's incredibly slow for the flow of gameplay, and watching Evie shimmy along this line looks embarrassing. I understand needing a quicker way to scale the buildings horizontally, but also copying the Arkham games is a weird way to go about it. Speaking of Arkham, the combat, movement, and even the whole fear system is a direct rip-off of Arkham Knight, and it confuses the life out of me because it's not exactly a system that goes hand in hand with Assassin's Creed. However, I have to compare Syndicate's new fear system here in Jack the Ripper because it is well implemented story-wise. The idea of performing these brutal takedowns that scare nearby enemies is a great idea and fitting for the Ripper's killings, and giving Evie a new non-lethal version adds to this tremendously by showing not only the parallels between Evie and Jack, but how Evie is becoming more like him. The prime example of this is at the end of the game. For context, to perform a brutal assassination, you need to hold the respective assassination button and then tap it repeatedly to complete the takedown. However, Evie uses a non-lethal version and Jack uses his knife and takes more enjoyment from his killings, so occasionally you'll have a few extra button prompts like the directional thumbstick being used to direct the way his knife moves. This makes you feel organically more connected to the Ripper's actions, and feel just as disturbed as if you were the one choosing where he stabs his victim. However, I noticed something. In the final boss fight of the game, which features Evie killing Jack, this is the only time in the game that Evie gets the same button prompts as Jack, and I love this attention to detail, implying that Evie, in the closing moments of the game, may be enjoying killing Jack. And wow, I wish the confession scene leaned into this more, because what a crazy, morbid, but cool idea to portray. It's why I would have genuinely enjoyed a follow-up expansion where we explore Jacob's reaction to his sister's different personality. Maybe even set it back in India for an interesting new backdrop. Aside from this, the fear system can be quite broken, as by the time you've completed the upgrade tree, nearly every enemy will run away after a single brutal assassination, and therefore enemy encounters lose a lot of the threat, which I guess makes sense because we're supposed to be what they're scared of. In regards to the newest black box missions added, I think they actually succeed by having each black box mission be designed as its own separate area, and not as a part of the larger open world, acting as a way to start each player at the same point to fully utilise all of Evie's new unique items, to navigate the level in the way the game wants you to. This was the closest the game got to the superb Hitman reboot style levels, where Hitman seemed to have taken what worked here and ran with a focus on gameplay and a small but tight level design that gives the player as many options as possible in a difficult environment. Unlike Hitman, these levels don't have replayability, with a straightforward winning route that the other opportunities only make more cinematic and easier to reach. This could be seen as a negative, but I think the missions were still discovering what they wanted to achieve, and offer a level of complexity not yet seen in an Assassin's Creed game before, and I'm actually really excited that Mirage is going to bring them back. Another thing I want to mention is that Jack the Ripper has a gang. Specifically, he's taken over the Rooks from Jacob, complete with a cute purple uniform, and this is so dreadfully tone deaf. As a way of giving you enemies to fight, these are ex-assassins. Why hasn't Jack killed them? I get that it's going for a Joker thing, where the people are inspired by Jack's actions and fight in his name, but also, the assassins already fill that role. You can't then create a violent version of the assassins and call that a new faction. My final note regarding the gameplay is just how the world is presented. It can't be undermined just how much better a depiction of Victorian London this is, and traversing the streets feels fittingly bleak and depressing. Including locations like the Insane Asylum and the Hulk Prison do well at showing the worst this period has to offer, alongside the dependency, and the side quests demonstrate effectively that crime was rampant in this period because of the unfair conditions and not because of a cartoonish Templar gang roaming the streets.
Welcome to the reunion, Miss Fry.
Jack the Ripper has a confused narrative, but wholeheartedly taps into the pulse of a Victorian Assassin's Creed game, and while never fully committing to the franchise's biggest themes and factors, it does define itself as a bold attempt to wash away the bad taste Syndicate left behind, and take these characters in an interesting new direction, if only for the last time. As I've tackled both Evie and Jacob as separate characters, I've seen their ups and downs, and here they are at their best, being the first time I could fully truly connect and understand why the twins were chosen for this game. I think surprisingly, Jacob comes out on top here, because what he's given is scarily good development, and he's taken out of the picture quickly enough that none of the setups can then be damaged later on. I do think while Evie is consistent here with her Syndicate self, there's just something missing. She doesn't seem to have as much of an arc here, but much like Jacob in Syndicate, has suggestions of where her character could go, without delivering on much of it, and her more important developments happen far too late into the game when there's not much time to actually explore them. I think as an extension of Syndicate, it gives the fanfiction writers a holy grail amount of content to explore, and I thought the Connor and Shay interaction was ripe for interpretation. This doesn't excuse any of the narrative mistakes, however. The pacing is quick, but it doesn't always serve a purpose, with the first act being a good catalyst for Jack to take action on his own, if not explained very well. The second act is solid on a visual and gameplay sense, but again doesn't serve a purpose, and it's only in the third act where all of Jack's motivation and his final plan and his defeat are condensed into an hour of investigation-style missions that cram in exposition before a slaughterhouse of an ending that abruptly concludes the story, making it feel unfinished or rushed. As much as I'm a story-first kind of guy when it comes to this series, this was the first time I stepped back and just enjoyed the atmosphere the game presented. It's visually a treat if you enjoy the darker Sherlock Holmes style of storytelling, and for me, it succeeded. For a series like Assassin's Creed, which has always struggled to toe the line between fun and sincere, this is and sometimes boring, this is hands down the most tonally consistent piece of content the series has ever had, and it never strays too far away from its goal. Enough that I would consider Jack the Ripper a success, if an admittedly flawed one. Now originally this series was meant to be 3 parts. I was going to look at Evie, Jacob and Jack the Ripper. However, I was quickly reminded in the comments that there is actually another character that you can play as in this game. The character that Ubisoft tried to hide from you. And I'll see you next time when we'll explore that further. Looking at Lydia Fry.